Welcome everyone to the webinar organized by CBM, Christian Blind Mission. And the title is Fighting Exclusion Through Early Action. My name is Talal Wahid, and I'm the Global Advisor for Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction, also known as DIDRR. Please keep yourselves muted. Okay, so sorry for the technical glitch. I hope it's working well now. First, some housekeeping stuff. Please keep yourselves muted. In this webinar, you give consent to that. Translation is available in French and sign language. This can be activated by clicking on interpretation icon. Automated captions can be toggled, switched on or off.
Hey, I hope you can see me. Talal just asked me to step in as he's experiencing connection issues. As Talal welcomed you already and started with some practical matters. As he said, we've got sign language interpretation as well as French interpretation available through the interpretation button and also automatic caption. We will have as presenters Talal Wahid, one of our two global advisors on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Then Ibrahim Malam Sumaila, also a CBM global advisor on disability inclusive. Oh, Talal, are you back? Apologies. So also Ibrahim is also one of our global advisors on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Sean Gregg will present our new DIDRR mainstreaming guidelines and his findings when he did some research together with CBM on DIDRR. And now, because we had a change in our other presenter, apologies for that. Talal, are you able to step in?
Sure. I hope you can hear me well now.
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. Sorry for this commercial break right in the beginning, guys. So we will try again. And thanks, Michael, for stepping in. Workshop also provides automated captioning. Please bear with us as the captions might be a little bit incorrect depending on the speech of different presenters. So after the event, we will share the corrected recording with all of you with the corrected captions. Started working on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction as an area under community-based inclusive development.
Okay, I think Talal continues to experience challenges with this connection. So let me quickly talk about the flow. We will have a series of presentations, but as you can see in the chat window, there will be a slot for questions and answers. So please either write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or raise your hand during the Q&A session. We will try to collect those questions and try to address them in a facilitated session at the end of the presentation. I think it's time to start with our presentations, and apologies once again for the technical challenges. But I think that's something not unknown in the context where we work with disasters and other challenges. Then we Sorry. Ibrahim, would you be able to take over?
Okay, thank you. Good day, everybody. I hope you're seeing my screen. So I'm going to share with you some of our study inclusive early warning system that, as we said, that early action save lives. So this study has been conducted in Cameroon and Niger. So in the agenda, we can see that we can have a background for this study. What are the geographical scope of this study, the key objectives, methodology that has been used to conduct this study, what are the stakeholders that have been involved in this study, the key findings, the barriers and the expectation, then the recommendation for an inclusive early warning system. So as for the background, you know that persons with disability and other people at risk groups are the most vulnerable in disaster. Most of the time, they are not really, they are forgotten in disaster risk reduction when we are planning or developing some policy or strategy. Most of the time, persons with disability are not included in those policies. And also in the action plan, you can see that there are many actions that are, but it's not easy to find the action that really is directed to the person with disability. They are most of the time excluded in the early warning system. So the multi-hazard disability inclusive early warning system is a very important part of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction intervention at the CBM, because the aim of our intervention is to prevent or minimize damage from the hazard. So to ensure a resilient programming programming for the community to be facing disaster. So CBM commissioned a participatory need assessment for drought and flood area in Niger and the Cameroon. So the geographical response, 4 regions has been concerned by this study. 2 regions in Cameroon, which are the southwest and the far north, and the region of Difa and the Tilaberi in Niger. So those regions are very vulnerable and they are very prone to flood and drought, because we have some flood that are coming from the heavy rainfall, and also from the overflowing of river, such as in Difa, Komadougou, or in Tilaberi with the river Niger. So, and the rainfall most of the time for the far north Cameroon are causing too much flood and the damage. So both of those regions are also prone to drought because they are in the semi-arid zone, which has some of period of 4 to 5 months of rainfall. So they are very prone to drought. So the key objectives of this study is to facilitate a design of a multi-hazard early warning system that engage persons with disability and the community at risk of drought and flood in an equal level. So early warning system disaster risk reduction programming remains some of the most effective ways to save lives during or before a disaster. Because of the importance of early warning systems, also we can see that even in the Sunday framework, it is the target G of the Sunday framework is a multi-hazard early warning system. So what are the methodology that has been? So we have the data collection. So the data have been collected in what are the early warning system in place, what are the communication and the systems and the coverage, what are the available tools and the technology for the early warning system in the region that, the 4 regions that has been covered by this study. So those data are collected, has been analyzed to relieve the needs and the gaps for the inclusion of persons with disability. What are the barriers that make persons with disability are not included in the early warning system? Which opportunity we can have from those data set up a kind of inclusive early warning system, and what are the expectations of the stakeholder that has been involved in this study. Then the recommendation, so we say that we need the priority area from the finding, from the key finding, the priority area has been set, and what are the target action based in the analysis of those priority, based on the analysis of the key findings, what are the action that can be taken to make the early warning system inclusive. So the stakeholder that has been involved are the disaster management agency, the early warning management agency. So in total, around 18 of those agencies has been consulted. So what are their roles? So they give the early warning, what are the current early warning system that they are using, and what is the limitation of those systems. So what also is the infrastructure of the early warning system actually in place, and what is the protocol in place in terms of early warning, how they are disseminating their message, the information about disaster, about hazard. So the second stakeholder are the partners of CBM who are working closely with the community and also with the person with disability. So their role here is to identify the disability and related needs, the including barrier and challenge in circulation of early warning system alert at the community level. So the third stakeholder that has been consulted in this study is the person with disability and the organization of person with disability. In total, 21 has been consulted, and their role is to give the challenge and the barrier in terms of inclusion in early warning system in place, and what are their expectations and what they are thinking for the next future roadmap to set up an inclusive early warning system. So the key findings. So for the key findings for Cameroon, the existing early warning mechanisms that are in place in Cameroon, we have the National Emergency Response Center, which has the aim to facilitate the flow of information in times of crisis. We have a DRR national platform that has been set up since 2008. We have also a national contingency plan. Then we have a daily weather forecast that has been disseminated through the TV and mostly through the TV in the evening and also in the radio. So for Niger, we have an early warning system unit, which set up the community early warning system and the emergency response at the regional level and even at the municipal level. And this unit is under the cabinet of the Prime Minister of Niger. We have also a disaster risk reduction strategy. So it includes a component of early warning, but it is not inclusive. We have a DRR national platform that has been set in place in 2012. And this DRR platform is under the Ministry of Humanitarian Action and Disaster Management. We have a flood contingency plan. Then also we have a daily weather forecast in TV and the radio to disseminate the information about the meteorological hazard such as heat, such as temperature and precipitation and the rainfall. Yeah. So then, in terms of the key finding, inclusion of early warning system and the disaster management process, we find that persons with disability were not involved in the design of early warning system. For instance, in Cameroon, all the persons with disability that have been consulted stated that they are not included in early warning process, in early warning system process. Well, in Nigeria, about 10% of the persons with disability say that they are part of the early warning system, but at the local level. So the early warning system also, they are not taking the needs of persons with disability. Actually, the current early warning system does not include the needs of persons with disability. And the third finding is the disability disaggregated data, which is not available for the DRM organization because they say that these are not making them to make more inclusive the early the alert that they are early alert that they are doing because they don't have the disaggregated data in person with disability. So what are the means of the communication? First of all, the information, the finding that the information is not accessible for many people. So they are they are not taking in terms of dissemination of the information, they are not taking into account the person with disability, how they can get the information so that it can be useful for them. The available tools that we find, the study find is the social media, WhatsApp, which is mostly used. We have the email, we have newspaper, radio, and the TV, which are used for the early warning communication at the national level mostly. And also in Cameroon, have funded the public announcement and the local DRR community who are used to disseminate the information and to disseminate early action and information in terms of flood and drought. So what are the major barriers to inclusion early warning system? There is lack of the disaggregated data as we stated earlier. We have insufficient participation of persons with disability in disaster management process. They are not involved, they are not consulted, so that they are not part of the process of developing early warning plan or contingency plan for flood or drought. They are not involved. We have a limited information in early warning system and inaccessible to target audience. So the information is not widely give to the large audience, even that it has it has reached the people. It is not in the accessible format for person with disability, because sometimes as they study so that even during the daily weather forecast in the TV or something, mostly they're now using the sign language to allow some people with disability to understand what the forecast is talking about. We have also a lack of knowledge in inclusive tools for communication channels, and this mostly come from the DRR early warning system agency say that what are the inclusive tools. They don't know actually the inclusive tools that really can allow them to reach the person with disability. So we have also find an inadequate policy to consider the specific need of person with disability. So policy are not taking the needs of the person with disability when they are developed. And the person with disability or their organization, they are not adequately engaged in terms of early warning system and the four regions that has been the study has been conducted. So what are the stakeholder expectations? So they are looking for to have a localized early warning system in the community, which can use the social media, which are mostly used in the community around now. because most of the person with disability that has been consulted have WhatsApp. They are using WhatsApp as a means of communication. So they have also need to add additional mode of communication to be adaptive and accessible related to their needs. So we need to have an end-to-end early warning system for the users, the end user, so that the community can really benefit for the early warning system that is going to be developed. We need to update and we need also a updated and reliable information in timing, date, and the location of the upcoming hazard. So the early warning alert that is going to be done, it has to be timely and also very reliable in terms of date and if possible, so the location of the upcoming hazard. And we need also to support the participation of and the empowerment of persons with disability in early warning system. It's very important and is expected from the person with disability, and then need to build the technical capacity and develop tools and materials for inclusive early warning system. And this technical capacity is also needed by all the stakeholders. I mean that the disaster uh, risk management agency, the early warning system agency, because they need some capacity building in inclusion. What are the tools that can be used to reach the person with disability, and how the message, the format of the message for early warning system should be for person with disability. So from those key findings, so we come that to have an early warning, a multi-hazard early warning inclusive system, we need to ensure the stakeholder engagement. So we have to foster the collaboration between the disaster risk management agency, the broadcaster, and the OPD's capacity building, accessible communication of means need to be brought to those stakeholders. We have to mainstream the disability issue in disaster risk reduction strategy. We have also to train the organization of persons with disability in the right and accessible to early warning system. We need also the disability disaggregate data. So this is very important in terms of to make sure that we can have an inclusive risk assessment. We can have also accessible monitoring and the predicting system, and we can develop information communication system that can reach all the persons with disability depending on the type of their impairment. Then we need inclusive need-based early warning system. So this must provide information in different formats, such as verbal, visual, and writing, and we must recognize the uniqueness of hazard when communicating alert. Terms here, for example, when we are communicating in terms of flood, we know that flood is a kind of sunset, very early hazard that can come. So we need to give this early warning alert is timely, and even the location where this hazard can come. When we take as drought is a slow hazard which can take time, so it's very different from the flood. So the kind of communication alert that is going to be give in terms of flood is different for the kind of alert that is going to be give for drought, because for the drought it can take much time. There is something that is very slow. So we need also to pilot an inclusive early warning system. So for that, we need an inclusive risk assessment. When we are doing the risk assessment, it should be inclusive. We must include the person with disability in all the steps. And we need also to develop a monitoring and the predicting system so that we can have a feedback, and the accessible monitoring person with disability can participate in the monitoring, and so that their needs, and we are sure that we can take their needs in terms of the predicting system that are going to be developed, and also the information communication system that are going to be developed. It can take the needs of the person with disability. So any question? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. So Ibrahim brings along a wealth of experience on climate action, early warning systems, and disaster risk reduction. He's also an environmental management engineer by profession and working with CBM for a little more than 1 year. Very compelling findings from your report, Ibrahim. We came to know about tailored early warning systems in both types of hazards, different sort, of course, for the floods, and a very, very unique type of early warning systems that are required in both Cameroon and Niger on floods, basically. Also, it's important thing to note that in addition to the systems made available for the communities, it's also very important to enhance the community ownership and to reduce the barriers that may hinder full usage or utilization of these early warning systems that are potentially life-saving for various persons with disabilities across the globe. Thanks, Ibrahim, once again. Now I would take you to our next speaker, who is Dr. Sean Gregg, academic consultant with CBM International, honorary professor with University of Cape Town, and chief editor with the Disability Journal for Global South. Dr. Sean will present mainstreaming disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in community development guidance for action. The floor is yours, Sean.
Hello and good morning, everyone. So let me share that. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you, Talal, for the introduction. I will start off by giving a bit of a background as to why these guidance notes came together. So first of all, a very usual background that we present is that persons with disabilities ultimately confront extraordinary barriers and obstacles in disaster response, but also in mainstream disaster risk reduction. And they are often excluded or marginalized. And we are all here because they are left exposed and vulnerable. But the background to it was actually a situation analysis that I conducted as part of my role as an academic consultant in disaster risk reduction with CBM, where actually I am part of the flagship program, which is community-based inclusive development. And I wanted to try and see the extent to which the IDRR is being mainstreamed within CBID, as opposed to being an additional program, so to speak, and to see the extent to which it is actually infused within CBID. And through that, to come up with reflections as to and implications for broader community-based development programs, which is why we are here. And the crux of it all is that community development in itself has a major role to play in disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And this integration, so to speak, is necessary to ensure that community development programs are designed and implemented with a cross-cutting focus on resilience, protection, and preparedness. And importantly, the IDRR also helps to ensure that community development programs do not collapse in times of crisis, which was a major lesson during the COVID pandemic. But what do we mean by mainstreaming? And this is what informed my work doing this, I come from critical disability studies as well, is how do we move beyond mere token inclusion. So when we are speaking about mainstreaming, we are speaking about DIDRR that is infused within and cross-cuts community development at all levels. That also impacts how community development is designed and delivered. So what I found in the situation analysis initially was that disasters and climate change are not core issues in community development. So whilst disasters may interrupt community-based development, essentially they are viewed only as a concern when they actually do happen. So people go into panic mode when systems and programs collapse. So what we had here, we started seeing a situation where disasters are not infused or ingrained within community development activities. For example, those focused on livelihoods or inclusive education. And altogether, this makes the mainstreaming of the IDRR difficult, and importantly, it weakens very much the impact of isolated efforts. This is something we started seeing in our own CBID programs. And essentially, the core problem is that I started saying that there are siloed approaches, which means that some CBID programs, for example, in this case, are infusing elements of DIDRR, for example, resilience when it comes to livelihoods, to minimize losses and also costs through stresses and shocks. But DIDRR, once again, still is perceived as a separate specialist area of intervention, something apart from community-based development, or persistently recast as somebody else's responsibility. And what does this mean? That the focus is a reorientation towards existing challenges as opposed to forecasting or preparing for future ones. And we started seeing a number of barriers. One is a reactive approach to disasters. So there are issues in planning, strategy coordination, and lack of harmonization. So once again, reacting to disasters as opposed to planning, and lack of investment in prevention, especially in areas that are costly. We also saw that there was a lack of guidance on how to go about including DIDRR in community-based development. So whilst at the level of rhetoric, we do hear a lot about DIDRR, guidance is still sparse and this discourse is still very much fragmented. There is also a lack of deliberate and focused planning to incorporate disasters and climate change in community-based development. Importantly, in the situation analysis, we saw that there is still lack of flexibility and cumbersome bureaucracy, and that also includes within our own CBID programs. That these programs are planned, structured, and executed, but leave very little to no flexibility to quickly shift things around in an unexpected situation. Efforts were made, very constructive efforts during the COVID pandemic, which did leave some very important lessons, for example, on how to have a small sum of money to be able to tap into in times of crisis. Importantly, there is little accounting for disasters at the level of planning, and sometimes a sluggish or slow approach when quick response is required. This is something that does happen very much in international NGOs. In fact, bureaucracy can be so cumbersome that it often acts as a disincentive to engage with disasters and to incorporate the IDRR in the first place in mainstream community development programs and organizations working in these. Critically, we found that very often there is no contingency funding that is inbuilt into community-based development, or in our case, community-based inclusive development programs. So, which means that programs in practice, despite the rhetoric and despite the strong emphasis on DIDRR amongst some of us, the truth is that we have very little capacity to prepare for or respond. For example, a crisis modifier is very often not applied. Once again, what it does is it reinforces the mentality that disasters and DRR are in fact no business of community-based development. And critically, I started saying that there was a stronger focus on slow onset natural disasters and the corresponding tendency to ignore the human disasters that follow, for example, conflict or forced migration. We are still way backwards when it comes to understanding critically and intervening in the linkages, for example, in how migration on the basis of drought, for example, may result in conflict in new host communities towards these forced migrants. Importantly, and this is very critical, whilst there is a very strong focus on OPDs participating in and owning the DIDRR process itself, the truth is another, that very often OPDs are struggling economically and politically, and they also lack capacity to intervene in DIDRR. They may not always exist or may not always be legally registered. Very often they do not have adequate structures in place, for example, to pay salaries or to receive funds, which means that INGOs like ours will not engage them directly. And many of these OPDs are in fact in many places composed of people living in poverty, giving their time voluntarily, which means that survival takes priority and not the IDRR. They are short on financial, social, and linking capital, which means that they do not have access to corridors of power, and gaining access to these corridors of power requires resources itself. We have also found, including in a recent study that we conducted on the localization of the CRPD, that there's sometimes lack of coordination and even internal conflicts between these OPDs, which challenges the notion or our construction of these OPDs as somehow homogeneous and collaborative. Organizations are organizations at the end of the day. And importantly, as Ibrahim did mention, there's a persistent lack of data and also problems in accessing or creating it. In fact, what we have is a situation of fragmentation or absent disaggregated data, which does impact advocacy very often with external stakeholders, and importantly, internally within organizations. It does impact the importance of addressing the IDRR or mainstreaming the IDRR within community development. So all this led to guidance notes. We were very careful to not call them guidelines because we are very wary of the fact that they are not, and there should never be a prescriptive or a generalized approach towards the IDRR or how to go about doing this mainstreaming. So what we came up with were 20 action points, and these bring together the reflections from the situation analysis that I conducted, and a previous study focused on good practices in DIDRR. And we adopted a critical approach whilst doing this. So rather than go the descriptive route, we did try and pose some critical questions, so that like that, we do not go down the usual straight route, but to try and find some alternative places to go to and some critical questions to pose in the process. So I will quickly go through these 20 action points. So you will be able to download the report, so I will not bore you silly with all the details, but we did address some issues like, for example, that key terminology needs to be known amongst community development organizations. So whilst we do speak very easily about DRR and DIDRR, there are still major problems when it comes to understanding key tenets and concepts itself, and the complexities of these tenets across cultures, spaces, and places. This includes how we actually understand disability itself, or the heterogeneity of disability as a complex life condition. There are still issues, for example, amongst organizations to actually identify the main hazards and understand the potential for disasters in a specific area where these organizations are operating. Importantly, there's a need for community development organizations to educate themselves about disasters, climate change, and also DIDRR. Critically, and the fourth point is particularly important, there needs to be an intentional effort to understand why there is a need to actually mainstream the IDRR and what some of these arguments are. And this is an exercise that organizations can and possibly should do on the ground, because otherwise it will be persistently seen as something imposed from the outside. Once again, and within this, why the focus on persons with disabilities in disasters? There is still lack of contextualized knowledge and lack of disaggregated data as well, but also lack of information at a very local level as to why persons with disabilities struggle, particularly when it comes to disaster situations. We address in these guidelines issues like conducting a disability inclusive disaster risk reduction process, and to understand how disaster ready is your program. So to actually conduct a critical reflective process, looking at programs themselves and trying to see how strong or resilient programs are in practice, which is something that many organizations struggle to do because the status quo sometimes is more important than actually addressing the problems that are faced. Importantly, the needs to collect data. One important point here is that mainstreaming starts from planning. One thing we did understand is that if this mainstreaming process is not addressed directly right from planning, this exclusion cascades all the way down, right down to operations themselves. So it needs to start from planning, and there needs to be a budget in place, and all stakeholders need to be on board. Importantly, and this is something very well known, is how to go about infusing resilience in all aspects of programming and projects. Point 12 is very important. The need to support OPDs in leading on the IDRR beyond the generalized assumptions that we often make. As I mentioned earlier, OPDs may not actually exist. They may not actually be in place because they lack funds, and also they do need help, for example, with accessing corridors of power. And this exercise cannot be done on the cheap. And there is also a very important need to see how to rope in OPDs that are not registered, but are actually the ones without all the fanfare, but who are actually doing work on the ground. There's a need to include disability in talk on disability rights, and also in lobbying for disability rights. A need to understand who is doing what in the mainstream and then to train them. One issue that emerged is that sometimes there is a very convoluted panorama of who the local stakeholders and national stakeholders are, who is doing what, and how to actually bring these people together, and also to educate them about disability itself and the complexity of disability, not as a mere add-on in disaster risk reduction efforts. That disaster risk reduction, the mainstream, needs to transform to accommodate, to genuinely accommodate persons with disabilities. So there's a need to monitor for accessibility and to infuse build back better principles. Importantly, there's an active need to pay attention to intersectional areas. So issues like race, age, caste, ethnicity, class, migratory status, for example, if a person is a refugee, type of disability, religious or ideological beliefs or grouping. And these intersectional areas not only need to be understood, but also we need to understand how they actually impact the IDRR at the core and the accommodations that need to be done so that everyone is actually included and the complexities are critically understood. We need to engage in activities like disability inclusive community mapping, for example, to actually know where persons with disabilities even are located within communities. Ibrahim spoke about understanding early warning systems and how to inform others and to ensure that these are fully inclusive. Importantly, and this is a key point, we need to work with communities and strengthen their disaster readiness. And importantly, the IDRR is not possible without it being a legitimate activity within and rubber stamped by communities themselves, which means that key contacts need to be made and be brought on board. We need to build flexible response in community development, which means that contingency funding needs to be there. Advocacy on itself does not work. and is limited. Very often, organizations might take the cheap route of trying to advocate with local politicians. I've had a lot of experience with this, who are not remotely interested in including persons with disabilities, which means that community development organizations sometimes need to act and intervene themselves. So how do we go about concluding this? Importantly, so here, the process of mainstreaming itself is continuous. It is not something that happens at a particular time and ends at a particular time. Critically, it involves commitment from multiple stakeholders. And this includes not only politicians, local organizations, INGOs, and OPDs, but every other person and the particular communities. There needs to be a self-reflexive exercise by organizations like ours to understand what it is about our own policies and practices that might be actually working against or hindering this process of mainstreaming. There need to be, importantly, deliberate efforts at mainstreaming and to communicate this across the organization and any partners. Critically, as I mentioned before, mainstreaming starts from strategic development, planning, and design. And any project proposal, any future project proposal needs to reflect this. Otherwise, this exclusion, as I stated before, will cascade all the way down. Importantly, organizations want and need money, so we need to include DIDRR alongside climate resilience as conditions for funding, for example, with our own partner organizations and, for example, OPDs applying for funding with us. We need to encourage joint projects and collaborative proposal writing between organizations working in community-based development and DIDRR and disaster risk reduction, and to integrate these. Importantly, as I mentioned before, we need to support local organizations with advocacy with powerful stakeholders, including government authorities, DRR departments, etc. As I mentioned before, many OPDs on the ground lack in particular, linking social capital and access to corridors of power. This process itself cannot be assumed, and this process itself needs money. It cannot happen on the cheap. We need to ensure buy-in by communities, as I mentioned before, to participate and own the IDRR. And importantly, we need to open channels to communicate and work with the national DRR systems. But this will not merely happen by training OPDs on advocacy itself. There needs to be active intervention. Critically, we need to provide funding with no shortcuts. Crisis modifiers need to be actively built into community-based development programs so that they do not collapse every time there is a crisis. And this needs to be part and parcel of budgeting. We also need to provide funds for the logistics of mainstreaming. This cannot happen on the cheap either. Programs need flexibility. We need to lessen bureaucracy to be able to access emergency funding. We need to move beyond simply focusing on natural disasters and to understand holistically and in the most complex ways how DIDRR is framed and operates within context. Importantly, we need to provide knowledge building and training on DIDRR at all levels. From our experience, this will not merely happen online or through some one-off training. Many people I interviewed called for in-person, localized, and importantly, training that is country relevant rather than training that is generalized and that might be disassociated from that particular context. We need to get all partners on board to mainstream the IDRR and to prepare them to work in and across multiple sectors to be able to respond. Importantly, and this is something that emerged, government systems need training and strengthening. We cannot assume that they do know what they are talking about in mainstream DRR, or that they actually do understand why disability needs to be actively roped in. We need to educate emergency and other stakeholders on disability and how to assist and work with persons with disabilities, and to importantly train persons with disabilities directly on how to prepare for a disaster so that they do not have to depend on third parties who ultimately might not intervene. Thank you very much, and if there are any questions later on, we can address these.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Thank you very much for very insightful findings of the report on mainstreaming disaster risk reduction um, in community development. I would like to draw our attention towards using Q&A box for question and answer sessions. So feel free to drop in your questions if you have already, for example, on the early warning report to Ibrahim or to Sean for this presentation we just had. Some of the critical points that were highlighted in this presentation by Sean were to customize overall integration of disaster risk reduction depending on the local contexts. It's also very important to have contextual training as well as program development that includes disability inclusive disaster risk reduction and integrated or related areas such as climate action. The other point that also came out very prominently is also to include the organizations of persons with disabilities into this equation. And this is exactly where we naturally bridge to our next topic. We have the honor of having Ms. Zahida Qureshi from Society for Special Persons in Pakistan with us today, who is going to present the perspective from organizations of persons with disabilities in flood in Pakistan. She brings along over 2 decades of experience of working for persons with disabilities and their inclusion in disasters. She is also a president of her organization of persons with disability, and now she will walk us through some of her journey and will share her own insights into the whole process. So Zahida, welcome again, and it's while Zahida, I hope you can hear us. Meanwhile, Zahida is setting up her technology. So I will remind all of us that the closed captioning is also available for this webinar. That may not be 100% accurate, depending on the speed. With corrected captions later on. So thank you for bearing with us. I hope, Zahida, you can hear us and you want to start. Okay, we wait a bit for, I can actually share that the CBM Disability Inclusion Inclusive DRR agenda into its community development programming. We have a long-term strategy that allows various sectors such as social protection, physical rehab, ear and hearing care, inclusive education, livelihoods, technical accessibility, and DIDRR under the community-based inclusive development umbrella, which actually gives a message and also leave the communities behind when there is a disaster. That is how we park DIDRR under long-term development agenda. We also look at overall prioritization of countries on various scales that are available globally, such as human climate related implications and disaster risk. So based on those, we rate different countries and our programs on those scales regularly to come up with prioritized countries where we have a dedicated focus and attention towards programming. It's also very important to talk about the engagement of OPD. in the disaster risk reduction progress. So overall, Zahida brought along an example where she lives in the south of the country, which is very, very flood prone. And she has actually established this Society for Special Persons 2 decades ago in that flood affected area. She also established linkages with the local government there in the south of Pakistan and coming up with approaches to influence the policies of disaster management from community to the national level. She's also quite well known in advocating for the inclusion of women with disabilities in disaster and development. And some of her experiences she wanted to highlight included the fire on 8th October in Pakistan that damaged various areas and displaced hundreds and thousands of people. Many people acquired disability as a result of that disaster that left hundreds of people dead. Beyond that, her organization of Person with Disability, shortly known as OPD, also played a role in advocating for humanitarian inclusion during 2010 floods in Pakistan and also subsequently in 2011. During the pandemic, she had been playing a role in ensuring that people with disabilities can have access to the information they need during the heightened curfews or the blockage of free movement during certain times. By the local authorities to highlight that the overall existence of organizations of persons with disabilities in the pandemic was also challenged, taking care of the fact that not everyone was able to comprehend the information that was being provided by the local government. It was not always able, and from my experience, I can also say that not only in Pakistan, but globally, there were a lot of concerns in terms of ensuring the communication flow and accessibility of that communication during the emergencies for persons with different types of disabilities. As Sean highlighted, I think this is very, very important point to look at not only the exclusion of OPDs, but there is also another forgotten group in disasters. Among those are people with disabilities who are not visible or who may not be part of any OPD or any organized structure, or they did not have the opportunity to do so. Among those people are also women, men, and children who have acquired disability as a result of any disaster. And unfortunately, if we walk through the global map, world map today, wherever we laser light whatever region on the map, we see any kind of disaster happening, whether it's a war or it's a migration or it's a health emergency or any other kind of natural disaster. So with this increased vulnerability to different types of disasters, it's even more important and critical to think about an all-inclusive and comprehensive approach, which not only talks about including several groups such as persons with disabilities and other vulnerable groups, but also takes into account the sensitivity to various types of emergencies that are happening more frequently, unfortunately. We have also seen in the early warning study that it's an alarming state in some of the countries in West Africa where the early warnings do not even reach persons with disabilities, and that takes a lot of toll in terms of life. Translated into action in terms of evacuation. And also looking at the individual level inclusion, I think the policy level change is also kind of a driving factor in ensuring longer term crisis-sensitive development. In addition to all these factors that we have highlighted today, from OPD's participation to early action and also making development disaster resilient, it's also very important and link, and the communities that may not be structured are included in one way or the other. And best way forward is to move on with the most collaborative approach, making sure that there is less and less duplication of resources that would lead us to the maximum level of inclusion, not only in disaster risk reduction, but way beyond that. I would stop here and check if we have Zahida back online, or just give us a few moments. All right. Okay, so we see that unfortunately she's not here, her connection is not here. So overall, I have summarized the findings that she brought to the table. However, after the webinar, we will also make sure that her contribution and intervention is reaching to the interested participants who want that. Please feel free to reach out to us and let us know what you need. So from here, I take this opportunity to hand it over to my co-facilitator, Michael Schwinger, who will walk us through the Q&A session. Here, I would like to say thanks to all of you for your attention, and also reminding you to pose as many questions as you want for two speakers that we have, and also myself. So feel free to highlight your comments or questions. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Talal. And while we start this Q&A session, please keep asking your questions. And also, if you feel more comfortable asking, for example, in French, please do so. We'll be able to translate them. So we've collected a few questions. One of them was specific to Ibrahim. And Ibrahim, could you respond to where do you see the role of governmental disaster management authorities in including persons with disabilities in early warning systems? What is the exact role? What do governments need to do in order to make sure that persons with disability are included? And also maybe where do you see the obstacles or the challenges?
Thank you very much, Michael. So I think that the Disaster Risk Management Authority have an important role to play in the inclusion of persons with disability in early warning system, since that they are the ones that are producing the response in terms of disaster. So for them to have an adequate government intervention or institutional intervention, so to have an adequate response for that, I think that they have to make sure that the person with disability are included in the system of developing early warning system. Since before even the response, so they have to play this role, take account the role, the person see the person with disability, taking their needs, approach them and take their needs, to include them in the early warning system. What are the information, accessible information that they have to produce? They have to make sure that this information is very accessible to persons with disability, because they are the one that they are developing this message. So this message has to be very accessible for the person with disability. But as we said, that maybe I can jump the barrier that they have a lack. There's mentioned it that they have a lack of knowledge in terms of information tools that are very useful for the person with disability. So I think that they are the most critical actor in terms of producing and the inclusion of persons with disability, because they are one that are focusing all the information regarding the hazard, especially flood and drought. So if we need an early warning system to be very inclusive, I think that the disaster risk management agency have a very important role to play in terms of producing those information which are supposed to be very inclusive and accessible to persons with disability.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We've got a very interesting question here. If we speak about government, let's say we can assume that governments, even if they may be hit by certain disasters, a bit unprepared, but in general, they have a clear mandate of preparing for disasters and thinking about responses. But there was one question from the audience about other DRR actors, and especially when communities roll up their sleeves and respond in the initial phase of a disaster. Is there any recommendation how communities can best prepare so that even those ad hoc responses that come out of the community itself are more disability inclusive? What needs to be done so that persons with disability are not left out of that spontaneous first response?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to do is to make sure that there is advocacy in terms of disability around community that is affected. So first of all, those community has to know the right of persons with disability and what are their role that they can play in terms of in the response of this event. So the second one is that we need to collect the data. People around this community know to have a disaggregated data in person with disability, so that they can, during the response, they can easily reach the person with disability. So I think also there is a role in here for the local authority also to play. They can play a very big role of leading the process of the inclusion of persons with disability around the community, because those local leaders are very close to the community. The ones that are the connection between the local government, local authority, and the national authority, so that the needs and the right of persons with disability should be taken into account in the response that is going to be provided to the community in terms of, in case of disaster.
Okay, thank you. We then had a set of questions around funding to OPD. So there was the question, how do we address the challenge that many OPDs struggle with funding? And I would like to narrow it down to the context of DIDRR. And Sean, you have mentioned that actually limited funding to OPDs can result in a barrier and exclusion. So do we have, I'm asking all of you colleagues, any recommendations to say what would be a good way of also providing support to OPDs in this context? I think I'll open the floor.
Maybe I can add on that if yes, Zaida, you want to go ahead?
Yes, Talal, I'm here. And sorry, due to signal problem, my net is totally off, and that's why hardly 5 to 10 minutes I have to off due to signal problem. Yes,
No
I am.
problem, Zahida. So question we have, would you like to answer that? So the question is that how the organizations of persons with disabilities can be supported for resource mobilization, for fundraising. Is that the question correctly interpreted, Michael?
Yes, yes, आप बात करें.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, person
Go
with
ahead,
disability,
go ahead, Zahida.
disabled people. Yes, can I speak?
Yes, please.
Yes, person with disabilities organization has very important role in DRR because every disaster affect the life of people with disabilities badly. So this is very important to promote the inclusive DRR regarding the people with disabilities life. Disability has a lot of diversity with, so we have to work on it more closely and more effectively, and this work is very well with the support of, directly support of the disabled people organizations. And disabled people organization DPOs now are currently try to play their role in DRR, and they connect with government and other organizations, and with community supports they try to uh, 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 they try to uh, put their input, and in district level committee, disabled people organization and disability activists directly play their role to strengthen the life of people with disabilities and flood affected or other affects people with disabilities. As person with disabilities organization, we are also motivate the government and motivate the person with disabilities organizations how to connect with the government, how to manage the resources, and how to influence the policies, because policy is very important. Without policies we cannot move in the community. So where every DRR have their uh, uh, diversified policies regarding the people with disabilities. I saw in the field intellectual people with disabilities are badly affected in the rural areas, and they are neglected and very much isolated due to the effect of the disasters. So there is an entire need to save these people with disabilities, and especially women with disabilities in the rural and flood affected areas and disaster prone areas. So the program is more effective with the support of person with disabilities direct inclusion, because they are the best advocate of their disabilities, and we know our challenges, we know our issues, and we know the community situations. So there is a dire need to strengthen the inclusive DRR and more visible the role of people with disabilities and their organizations.
Thank you. I think, Sean, you also had some observations with regards to that.
Yes, thank you very much. I will perhaps add on and also challenge a bit. We need to also critically probe the notion of OPDs as some homogeneous, harmonized set of organizations. In fact, there are often, like any other organization, there are also deep power struggles within OPDs, across OPDs as well. You also have a tendency for OPDs formed of more privileged people from urban areas to have a louder voice and to be more heard, much more heard, than those who are in poorer associations that may not be registered formally, but who are actually working on the ground. And this is knowledge that needs to be sought out. I think we also need to move beyond the assumption that OPDs based on identity only may necessarily know what the local context very far away within one's own country actually looks like. or what disasters feel like for persons with disabilities. I have come across members of OPDs in some privileged spaces who do not know much about the context within other spaces within their own country. So I think apart from understanding these dynamics, I think in a more practical way, we need to try and find a way how to bring out, how to support those voices amongst OPDs that tend to be marginalized, that tend to be left out, who are members of places, who live in places directly impacted by crises and by disasters, who live poverty on their own skin. Because sometimes we do end up with a situation or context where the information that we work with is information by proxy and is not directly informed by persons with disabilities who actually do live disasters on their own skin. These organizations need to be sought out, the local associations. One other point, and I'll leave it at this, is that the conditionalities for OPDs to work with INGOs, for example, for them to be able to tick the box to receive funding and to implement projects, for example, as well, is bound to them being formally registered, have a bank account, have formal procedures in place to be able to manage these funds, which means that there is almost an automatic exclusion of all those who may be much more qualified to actually speak and intervene and advocate. And consequently, they are totally left out, which means that there is something that organizations and INGOs need to do something to rework how the funding mechanisms work, who is funded, and also who represents who. And this is a very important point that we need to move beyond. And here I am speaking about OPDs, and this applies to everyone in terms of there are also deep representational issues, which means that because I live in a certain country does not mean that I actually know what happens in my country. So we also need to be wary of these issues as well. And this applies to multiple organizations working in the field or where expertise is actually conferred. I do subscribe to, and this is very, very important, that OPDs need and must lead on the process. But we also need to see OPDs that are equipped and are well-resourced and do actually understand the disaster context at the most local level and the intersecting complexities between these. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. There's a related question, I think, and that is whether we do have a recommendation on what proportion of the budget should be allocated to ensure flexibility of CBAD programs and representation and participation. Talal, Ibrahim, do you have any recommendations for a specific percentage to ensure flexibility, but also a percentage that should be allocated to matters around participation?
So in terms of coming up with a generalized ratio or percentage within the programmatic budgets or the proposals, generally it leads us to the one size fit all solution kind of thing, which is not applicable in case of disaster risk reduction alongside many interventions. There has to be sensitivity to this allocation. And also this will largely depend on the kind of intervention. For instance, for let's say we want to construct an evacuation center. For the accessibility of that evacuation center, the allocation for inclusion-related matters and accessibility-related matters will be different from the program that we want to conduct, let's say, a protection-related program in a disaster-affected community. And there, the allocation would be entirely different. So it will largely depend on the intervention that is being planned in the community.
Thank you, Talal. Sumana, you had a question, and I also noticed that we have to come to an end. So let me say, as a response to some other questions, we will also share some documents later or some links. But now over to Sumana as the last question that we can address as part of this call.
No, sorry, so it's not a question. I was just wanted to give a kind of contribution to what Sean have said. If is allowed, I can do that.
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay. I think regarding the question of having people with disability included in the government reduction, disability reduction strategy. I think risk reduction strategy. I think, especially in the local level. Like he said, we need to invest more. What is I think is we need to more, because there are so many platforms at the local level. But what is missing? How to link people with disability to those platforms, local platforms. And the reason is they lack capacity. The OPD lack capacity. The level of organization, their capacity is very low. So we need to invest more at the local level. So that, because most of the time this is where the disaster is happening. Let's say in those prone areas where we need to intervene, we need to invest more. And by doing that, we need to really focus on the capacity of the OPD. This is very key, and we are not ready so far to do that. So this is why we need to invest more so that they can be prepared to join the local platform, and together with the other people without disability. So I think this is what I want to say. So the capacity issue is there, but we need to also to invest on their capacity, make them more audible, so that they can join the group and contribute, but also benefit from whatever will be done by the local platform. So this is what I think we could do that, and then from this the experience gathered there can inform even the national or regional policies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just we had two questions. That's why I mentioned the links that will be shared. One was about how do you initiate a disability inclusive anticipatory approach, and another one was around participation. And when we share the links, we will share the DIDR guidelines that Sean has presented, which will give some guidance on how to initiate such an approach as well. And also a link to the participation toolbox, which can help to plan how to better take a participatory approach. There was one question also of if any